Hi everybody, I'm Susan Mulvihill. Welcome back to our vegetable garden in Spokane, Washington. The hardiness zone here ranges from 5B to 6A. Well, today is an exciting day because I'm going to answer your vegetable gardening questions. About a week ago on my Facebook page, I asked folks, what types of things are you having problems with in your vegetable garden? What do you need to know a little bit more about? And boy, did I get a lot of comments on that. I don't want this video to be super long, so I'm going to try to keep it moving along at a good rate. And the other thing that I've found is, even though you might not have responded to that Facebook post, I've found that if one person has a gardening question on a certain topic, there's a whole bunch of you out there who have the exact same question. So I think all of this will be very helpful. Now, in order for this video to move right along and to help you find the types of answers you're looking for, I wanted to tell you the order of what I'm going to talk about. And also in the description on my YouTube channel for this video, I will put timestamps for each of them. So I'm going to talk about general information on when to plant vegetables, questions about specific vegetable crops, which vegetables tolerate some shade, vegetable disease issues, vegetable insect problems, plant disorders, some miscellaneous gardening questions, when to plant a fall garden, and fertilizers. So Arian and Michelle said they are struggling with when to start plants in the spring. And I have got a great free resource on my website, so I wanted to show that to you right now. So here's my website, susansinthegarden.com, and you'll notice there's a guides menu. If you scroll down a little ways, you'll see seed starting, when to plant vegetables for all zones. There's also one for zones 5 and 6 because that's what I garden in, but we're going to look at the all zones one because that will apply to everybody. So you'll notice there's 3 columns. The name of the crop, that's all alphabetical. If you start them indoors, you'll have the information in this next column. Or if you sow them directly into your garden from seed, this is the time frame here. And of course, I'm going to be planting some arugula shortly. And this tells me when I can plant it in the garden. In early spring, as soon as the soil can be worked, meaning when it's not too wet, or in late summer for a fall crop, and that's what I'm going to do. If you're growing something that you want to start indoors, for example, broccoli, it says start them indoors 6 weeks before the last spring frost, and then transplant them out in the garden after the danger of hard frosts has passed. So you can see there's a lot of information in here, and I think it will really help you out. So the main thing you need to start with is when your last spring frost occurs and your first fall frost occurs. And if you don't know that information, you can ask a gardening friend or neighbor, or you can contact your local Master Gardener program. It's a free service. I received a few questions about growing broccoli, and they primarily centered on why aren't my plants forming heads, or why are they only forming little heads? So I want to answer that question for you, and I also wanted to point out an important thing about how broccoli plants grow. So you're looking at our broccoli bed, and if you've seen my videos in the past, you know that I cover it with agricultural insect netting, and that's to keep aphids and cabbage worms away. So let's get it uncovered and answer those questions. Now you can see some of my broccoli plants. One of the impressions I got from the questions was that folks were planting broccoli after the danger of frost has passed. You don't want to do that. Broccoli loves cooler weather, so you want to plant them a few weeks before the danger of frost has passed. You should also occasionally feed your plants with a liquid nitrogen fertilizer, such as Alaska fish fertilizer, and that is to give them a boost. Typically what I do is I give them some fish fertilizer when I plant the seedlings in the garden, then about 2 weeks later, then about 3 weeks later, and so on. Other tips include spacing the plants appropriately so they have room to grow. So I think I probably planted mine about 15 inches apart. So if they don't have enough room to grow, they will be stressed. It's important to water them regularly. They really like that moisture. And of course, to give them protection from aphids and cabbage worms, like what I showed you with the insect netting, or you can use floating row cover. It works like a charm, so I heartily recommend it. If you're fairly new to growing broccoli, I wanted to point out something super important. So here is a single plant, and you can see where I cut off the main head, and that was probably about 10 days ago. The plants are not done producing for you. So what's going to happen now, and here's a perfect example of it, is it's going to develop side shoots. And it will do this for you all the way through the end of the garden season. So don't give up on your plants. Don't pull them up once you get that main head. You've got all sorts of harvests coming up. Tawny sent in a question saying that this is her first year of growing celery and that the plants are not doing very well. Any tips would be greatly appreciated. So I start my celery seed indoors about 10 weeks before the last anticipated frost date, and that's because they're super slow to get started. Then I transplant them out into the garden after the danger of frost has passed. You want to feed them with some Alaska fish fertilizer or other nitrogen fertilizer at planting time, and again 2 weeks later. And I have to tell you, my plants don't look all that great either, and I'm attributing it to our very strange weather where we've had so many wild temperature swings. Don lives in North Idaho, and he's having problems with his corn. He says that the plants are tasseling, but there's no ears below them to get pollinated. So let me show you the components of a corn plant so that you know what those terms mean. On the top of a plant, this is called the tassels, and on it are little pollen grains. Lower down on the corn stalk is where the young ears of corn develop. What's coming out of the end of them are the silks, and think of them as flowers because each one of those needs to be pollinated in order for you to get an ear that is just full of kernels and doesn't have any gaps in it. Now in Don's case, what's happened is he has some stalks that are tasseling, but they don't have any ears below. And that is a problem, obviously. I think you're doing all of the right things, Don. You're monitoring the plants, you're babying them, you're watering them well, and so on. I think we can attribute it to the very strange weather we've been experiencing this growing season. And I hate to just put it off on that, but we have a lot of things that are struggling in our vegetable garden this year, and the weather has just been all over the board. Lots of cold temperatures and lots of very, very hot ones. So I'm hoping that the majority of your crop is coming through for you. Grace and Karen indicated that they've been having problems growing onions, and specifically that they're not forming those big bulbs that we all love to harvest and eat. First of all, there are some basic needs that onions have in order to grow well. You want to choose a sunny location and prepare the soil by adding bone meal or another organic fertilizer that is high in phosphorus because that promotes root growth. Plant them early, so March or April, because they do their best when they can grow in the cool spring weather. Space the seeds, sets, or plant starts appropriately so they have enough room to grow. And be sure to water them regularly. Now that said, sometimes a variety just doesn't perform well. So you can see these onions are doing great. And then you go along the bed and what the heck? And then the remainder of the onions are doing great. This year, Bill decided to plant a new to him variety called Akatama Salad Red. That's what you're looking at. It grew for a while, and then all of a sudden their tops flopped over, and that was it. So they're done growing, but he was not expecting this in the least. And I also want to add as another tip that make sure you plant varieties of onions that do well in your climate. Lynn wants to know what the trick is to growing robust parsnips. First of all, prepare the planting bed by adding bone meal. Again, this is high in phosphorus and it promotes root growth. Don't give them manure. Plant the seeds directly into the soil in early spring. Once the seedlings are about 3 inches tall, thin them to a 3 to 4 inch spacing within the rows. That will give them enough space to develop. And be sure to water them regularly, but don't overwater them because that can make the roots split. Let them grow all season long and harvest them after they've been frosted because that makes them nice and sweet. Susie says she planted Yukon Gold potatoes in containers in late April. They've grown great, but they're starting to die off, it seems, early this year. And is it okay to harvest them in August? And I would say yes, because once the foliage has died off, nothing else is going to happen. And I would tend to use them right away because I don't think they'll keep well in storage. And you can see that some of the foliage in ours is dying off, so we may be in the same boat within the next few weeks. You can see that we're growing our potatoes in grow bags, and Frances wants to know how to clean and store grow bags year over year. You definitely want to clean them at the end of the season. First, I hose them out really well. Then I wash them with a weak bleach and water solution, and by that I mean 9 parts water to 1 part bleach. What I do is I fill up my wheelbarrow with that mixture and I soak the grow bags in it for about 30 minutes. Then I let them completely dry off in the sun and store them in a shed for the winter. Some manufacturers recommend washing them in a washing machine after that, but to be honest, I just don't feel comfortable doing that. Joe asked how to know when a winter squash is done and should be picked. What you want to do, Joe, is the fingernail test. What that means is you want to press your fingernail into the skin. If it easily pierces the skin, that means it is not mature enough, and just leave it in place and let it keep growing. But if your fingernail can't pierce the skin, it is ripe. When you're harvesting it, be sure to leave a couple of inches of the stem attached, and then move your harvest to a warm, dry area that's protected from the weather for 2 weeks. This is called the curing process, and what it's doing is it hardens off the skin so it will keep a long time in storage. This is definitely worth your time to do this. I've been doing it for years, and I cannot believe how long our harvest lasts. Okay, I hope I'm going to pronounce this next name correctly. Samuthi says they can never grow a good-sized pumpkin. So here are a few thoughts. First of all, have you chosen pumpkin varieties that are supposed to get large? I know that sounds like a silly question, but you never know. Second, how many days does the seed packet say it takes in order for the pumpkin to reach its mature size? Make sure that your growing season is long enough to accommodate that. There are some varieties that will produce a reasonable sized pumpkin in a shorter climate if that applies to you. Third, before you plant the seeds, be sure to add some bone meal to the soil in the bed first, because that will help the pumpkin plant produce flowers that will eventually turn into pumpkins. 4. Plant the seeds as soon as the danger of frost has passed. 5. Make sure your garden gets a lot of sunshine. A minimum of 6 hours per day is best. Be sure you water the soil in the pumpkin bed regularly so they'll grow well. And last but not least, if you have a lot of little pumpkins on a single plant, let them grow for a few weeks, and if none of them have fallen off, maybe remove some so that the plant can use its energy for growing a large pumpkin. I hope this helps. As you can see, our tomato plants are looking a whole lot better than they did 2 weeks ago. Sandy has 2 tomato-related questions. One is she's wondering if tomatoes can cross-pollinate, and the second one has to do with stink bugs. She's dealing with a whole bunch of them on the fruits, which is so annoying. First of all, regarding the cross-pollination, I'm wondering if you happen to save seeds maybe from a previous year, and if the variety was an F1 hybrid. because if that's the case, then the plants that you get from those saved seeds will not grow the same as the parent plants. If that's not the case, I suppose it's possible that a bee might have picked up pollen from one flower and gone to another plant. But generally speaking, tomatoes are self-fertile, so they pollinate themselves. So I'm just not 100% sure what might be happening there. Regarding stink bugs, the easiest way to control them is to carry a small quart-sized container that's been filled with water and a couple of squirts of dish soap, and then knock the stink bugs off the plants or fruits into the container. The soap prevents them from being able to get out of the container, and I've found that is the easiest way to attempt to control them. I know they are extremely troublesome, but there really aren't other good methods. Sarah wrote that she's dealing with some shade in her vegetable garden, and she's wondering if there are any vegetable crops that will tolerate some shade. And yes, actually there are. Now, as a general rule of thumb, most vegetable crops require a minimum of 6 hours of sun each day. But here is a list of ones that will tolerate some shade, and I had to write them down because I can't remember them all off the top of my head. So beets, bok choy, broccoli, cabbage, carrots, celery, chard, Chinese cabbage, kale, kohlrabi, leeks, lettuce, mizuna, mustard, pak choy, scallions, spinach, and turnips. So give some different ones a try, see how they do, and do a little bit of experimentation. Keely and Joan both asked about preventing powdery mildew, especially from getting on squash plants. Powdery mildew is a very frustrating plant disease. It's caused by fungi, and it looks like somebody has sprinkled bread flour or powdered sugar on your plants. It is spread by the wind and usually happens when temperatures are between 60 and 80 degrees Fahrenheit. How do you prevent it? First of all, there are actually varieties of crops that are resistant to powdery mildew. It will say this on the seed packet. So if you always are having problems with that, consider changing varieties. Give your plants the right spacing, which makes it a bit harder to spread from plant to plant. Don't give your plants a lot of nitrogen fertilizer because that promotes new leaves, and those new leaves are more susceptible to the disease. Water your garden in the early morning, and if you can, also use crop rotation each year when laying out your garden so that you're not planting the susceptible crops in the same location every year. That's because the spores can be present in the soil of the bed where you planted a crop. Now, some folks will use a biofungicide as a preventive measure, and you can find it in garden centers or online. Andrea asked how to protect garlic, shallots, and other alliums from onion fly. Their offspring, onion maggots, are an awful pest. The adult is a fly. It lays eggs in cracks in the soil around your plants. The eggs hatch into maggots, which feed on the plant roots for about a month. Then they pupate in the soil and emerge later as an adult fly to start the whole process all over again. They will damage garlic, leeks, onions, and shallots. So here's some advice for dealing with them. First of all, my best advice is that if you had them last year, skip a year of growing onion crops. I know that is really hard to do, but you can patronize your farmer's market, right? Also, clean up damaged plant debris at the end of the season and dispose of it rather than composting it. Plant onion family crops in different areas of your garden or your yard each year if you can. Don't use animal manures because they attract the adult flies and the maggots. Consider growing your onion crops under floating row cover since they don't need to be pollinated. Keep an eye on your crops throughout the growing season for any signs of infestation. And if you have a particularly bad infestation, consider adding beneficial nematodes to your soil. Those are microscopic roundworms that will target the maggots, and you can find them at sources like arbicoorganics.com. Betsy says this is her first year of using ag netting over her cabbage family crops, and so far so good. She's wondering how careful you have to be when you open the cover to weed or mulch. Can't insects enter when it's open? So here's my thoughts. As long as I'm paying attention while weeding or mulching, it's okay to leave the cover off. Otherwise, I just move part of the cover, do what I need to do, then recover that area and move on to another. But definitely cover everything as soon as you're finished and weigh down those edges. Kay is interested in organic control of grasshoppers, and oh my, they are so destructive. She mentioned also that she has used an organic product called Nolobait that I'm familiar with, and for some reason it is not available this year, which is kind of odd. So she's wondering what she can do. So first of all, I didn't know that Nolobait wasn't available this year. I have no idea why. But I did find something that is under a different brand name but the same type of product, and it's called Semaspore. It's carried at planetnatural.com, so that's a source for you to check out. Now here are some other ideas to try to deal with those darned grasshoppers. First of all, plant cilantro, calendula, and horehound near the plants you're trying to protect because they will repel grasshoppers. Cover susceptible crops with floating row cover, especially if they don't need to be pollinated. And then use organic products, which are particularly effective when the grasshoppers are young. That's important. So things like insecticidal soaps, kaolin clay, neem oil, or plant extracts. All of those are organic. I hope this will help. Marcia says that every year it's a losing battle keeping aphids out of her lettuce. I've never actually had them bother my lettuce, so I think that is extremely annoying. I always cover my lettuce bed with either floating row cover or agricultural insect netting, but not to keep insects away, but rather to keep birds from nibbling on the leaves. So that's what I would recommend you do, since lettuce plants don't need to be pollinated. I'd also suggest that you plant your lettuce in different areas of your garden and always clean up plant residue at the end of the season, especially if you've had problems with aphids. Kim wants to know if there's any way to save squash plants after bugs get into the stem. And I'm sure she's referring to squash vine borers, which are absolutely awful. Now, I shouldn't admit this, but we don't have them in our garden, and I think that's because we're out in the country where there aren't other vegetable gardens nearby. But yes, it's possible to cut into the affected stem and remove the larva, or to pierce right through the larva to kill it. Be sure to cover that cut area of the stem with soil or tape to help the plant heal. And always dispose of any affected plants rather than composting them at the end of the season, because that just continues the problem otherwise. One preventive method you might try is to immediately cover your seedlings with floating row cover to keep the adult moths away. You can remove it once the plants start flowering, or you can hand pollinate the flowers, which is actually pretty easy. Deborah mentioned that she's noticed a lot of gardeners have trouble with blossom end rot, and I would agree. So this is a plant disorder rather than a disease. What happens is that developing fruits, such as tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, and squash, need calcium in order to grow normally. The calcium is in the soil and the plant's roots collect it. But they can't do that if the soil isn't lightly moist. That means it's important to be consistent about watering your plants to help the roots do their job. I want to add that most folks' soil has plenty of calcium. Again, it's the soil moisture that is the key. I've heard people say they add Tums or other antacids to the soil, or they pour milk over their plants. Neither of those work, and they're a waste of your money, to be frank. Water your garden consistently. Now, in the description of this video on my YouTube channel, I will include a detailed video that I shot a few years ago about blossom end rot, and it will tell you everything you need to know. So be sure to look for that link. Pam wrote that she tried some seed tape and it didn't work. And you know, I know a lot of people successfully use seed tape, but I've actually never used it, to be honest. And it is a great tool for planting seeds at the correct spacing. Now, since I haven't used it, I did do some quick research to see why it might have failed for you. And I came up with a few things. First of all, it might have been too hot or too cold for the type of crop that you planted. It might have been that the soil was either too moist or too dry, or it might have been that the seeds were no longer viable. So I hope this helps. Don't give up on it. If you want to use that type of method, just give it a try again next year. I received a comment from another Susan who's feeling very discouraged with her garden this year. She says that she planted the first week in June, but everything looks so far behind compared to the other gardens she's seen. She's wondering, did she start too late? That possibly is it. Does she need to test the soil, or does she need to be fertilizing and watering more? So all of these are possibilities, but I'm sure sorry that you're having a tough garden season, because we all love to grow a garden, and when it doesn't go right, it's extremely frustrating. I don't know where you live, so I'm not sure of the planting time for you, but I would recommend you look at my planting chart that I mentioned at the beginning of this video, because to me, early June sounds a bit late. Also, make sure that you're watering your plants on a regular basis, especially if you're dealing with a heat wave like we are. You're wanting the soil to be lightly moist most of the time, and definitely not muddy and wet, and definitely not bone dry. So keep an eye on the watering, and of course when it's hot you need to give your plants more water. I don't think you need to have your soil tested if you've had successful gardens in the past. And as far as fertilizer goes, I would recommend looking at the video that I will link to in this description so that you know which types of fertilizers to use, and then use them at the recommended intervals. I hope this helps. Hang in there. Sabrina and Kay put in comments wondering if it's time to pull a plug on their gardens because their plants are struggling so badly. Oh golly, this has just been such a tough year. If you don't need the garden space, I would say let the plants keep growing, because I have to tell you, just in the last week, our plants are suddenly back on track. So if you see there's still some green on the plants, then yeah, I would let them keep growing. But if they're completely dead, pull them out, and you might want to watch my video next week about planting a fall garden, because I bet you have enough time to grow some other crops so that the year is not a complete loss. I'm so sorry, this has just been one of those years. A lot of folks said they'd like to learn more about planning and planting a fall garden. That is such a great topic. As a matter of fact, it's so great I decided that will be the subject of next week's video. So I hope you don't mind waiting for a week, but I did want to give you a little bit of information in the meantime. So the first thing I want you to do is to determine when your average first fall frost occurs, and then count how many days that is from now. That will help you to choose your crops. For example, I'm shooting this video on July 23rd, and our first frost might occur in mid-September, although that has really been fluctuating lately. But that gives me approximately 54 days to work with. Plus, there are a lot of cool season crops that will tolerate some light frosts. So for now, figure out how many days you have, and then take a look at these seed packets. These are some examples of what I can plant now. So things like arugula, lettuce, Swiss chard, spinach, radishes, bush beans, that's a good one, and possibly broccoli, but it depends upon the variety. So keep that in mind for now, and then I'll get back to you with more details next week. A few people asked me about the types of fertilizers we use for our vegetable garden, and Beth mentioned that she has beautiful plants but not many blossoms on anything. What advice do you have to encourage more blossoms? So first of all, I want to start by saying that I have a great video that I shot this past winter that goes into the types of fertilizers you should use for each type of crop. I'm going to put a link to it in the description of this video on my YouTube channel. Now, to specifically answer Beth's question about how she has lush plants but no blooms, to me that says that she's probably giving them nitrogen fertilizer, which promotes leafy green growth. But if you're growing a crop that either needs to bloom and set fruit, or one that will produce a large root, such as carrots and parsnips, you need to give them a fertilizer that is high in phosphorus. So the middle number on the package should be the highest. I usually use bone meal for that purpose because it's organic and it's easy to use. If you're growing plants that you'll be harvesting the leaves from, such as lettuce, spinach, Swiss chard, and so on, that's when you want to give them nitrogen fertilizer, and that's the first number on the container. I hope this helps. Phew, we made it through all the questions. I hope you found this video helpful, and be sure to look at the description of this video on my YouTube channel because, again, I'm going to put timestamps so you know when the different topics are covered within the video. I'm also going to put links to some videos that I've done that drill down on specific topics that people have asked about, so look for those. But most of all, thanks for watching. It is getting super hot out here now, so it is definitely time for me to head indoors. Happy gardening, everybody.